Also, I haven't polished my shoes in 2 years.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming here tonight to celebrate author Joanna Pearson and her newest book, Now You Know It All. She's joined tonight by fellow authors J.P. Gritton and Michael McFee. My name is Marilla and I am the social media and events coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And honestly, I just want to say thank you for coming tonight and purchasing a book that really helps Flyleaf Books, keep going and also bring you more events. Also, to make events more accessible, we are recording tonight's event and it will be up on our YouTube channel soon. And to be considerate of our colleagues, we are asking authors to be done by around 7 p.m. so that, we can respect people's time. And finally, I'd like to briefly introduce tonight's authors. Joanna Pearson is a lapsed poet who once wrote a young adult novel and a whim, but nowadays mostly writes short fiction. Her first collection of stories, Every Human Love, was a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Awards, the Fort Worth Indies Awards, and the Janet Heidenberg Prize for Fiction. Her stories have appeared in Best Small Fictions and Best of the Net, as well as other journals. She holds an MFA in poetry from Johns Hopkins University Writing Seminars and an MD from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. A native of Western North Carolina, she now lives with her husband and 2 daughters near Chapel Hill, where she works as a psychiatrist. J.P. Gritton novels, a Kirkus Best Debut Novel of 2019 is out with Tin House. His awards include a Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fellowship, the Mary Goff Prize in Fiction, and the Donald Barkhelm Prize in Fiction. His stories have appeared or are forthcoming in Black Warrior Review, Greensboro Review, New Ohio Review, Southwest Review, Tin House, and elsewhere. He is an assistant professor of creative writing in the Department of English at Duke University. And finally, we have Michael McFee, who is the author or editor of 16 books. Most recently, We Were Once Here, Poems and A Planet Rebounds essays. In November 2018, he received the North Carolina Award for Literature, the state's highest civilian honor. He teaches poetry writing here at UNC. And just please give it up for tonight's authors.
So happy to be here with you. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with y'all. I feel honored to be on the stage with such esteemed writers, and thank you, friends, for coming in the pandemic. Thank you. We were just having a debate as to whether we would talk first, and then I would read a chunk, or I would read a chunk, and then we would talk first. I don't remember.
I think we landed. She needs to read something, doesn't she?
Yeah. All right. I'll read a little tidbit, and then I'll also reveal my bias, which I don't know what this tells you about me as a person. My bias is that I love to read a book on my own and commune with the words on the page, but then when I go to the readings, I actually tend to zone out what the author is reading, and I'm really there to sort of see what the author's like and what their voice sounds like and what they jabber about, like the interstitial, chit chat. That's the part that I like the best. So that tells you about me. But I will still read a brief bit for you. I think I'm just going to read a little bit from the very first story in the very first page, because why not? And this is from a story called Rome that originally came out in a magazine called the Swanee Review. There were ruins and fountains and a fury of beeping horns. Naked putty lounging fatly in marble. Gorgeous, long-armed women in skirts and strappy sandals, and young men leaning out of their cars in mirrored sunglasses. Old men in storefronts arranged cheeses and sausages tenderly, as if tucking in sleeping infants, while chattering tour groups trailed guides holding red umbrellas, and honeymooners licked perfect gelatos. There were long, hushed halls filled with onlookers crowding around famous paintings. Jesus flanked by apostles, emperors crowned with laurel, mythical women in half-dress being chased by centaurs. There were churches in which frescoes glowed in dim magnificence above altars, gold-coffered ceilings, pietas, aqueducts, domes. In the catacombs, we followed a man with a bow tie and a stutter who told us of the city, its slaves and rulers, while the bones around us listened in untroubled silence. We'd seen so much beauty by then, we'd been rendered insensate to it, like gorging on sweets to the point of sickness, or until one tastes nothing at all. Our eyes could not absorb one more basilica. We were tired and dust-covered, our shoulders sunburned. We were sick of each other, and sick of washing our underwear in sinks. We were finally seeing all the things, beautiful, famous things we'd waited all our young lives to see, but we couldn't appreciate any of it any longer. "Please don't talk to me," I said to Paul in the hostel's small kitchen, while a troop of merry Australians cracked open beers nearby. There are always merry Australians. Anyways, friendships formed quickly here, and yet somehow Paul and I had managed to remain alone. We were pinched and irritable looking, clutching our respective lonely planets like shields. We must have resembled a couple, even though we hated each other. Maybe this even made our coupledom appear more authentic. "Believe me, I have no desire to," Paul said, slapping two thickly slathered pieces of bread together into a peanut butter sandwich, like he did every night, no matter where we were. Who ate peanut butter sandwiches in Europe? This remains a good question outside of this story. The trip had seemed a good idea at first, but now even the sight of Paul, his socks, the sound of his breathing, the way he chewed, repulsed me. It was like a horrible stranger had assumed Paul's shape, donning his body like a cheap suit. Everything about him I'd once found pleasant or appealing had been twisted into cruel caricature. And yet here we were, with a coveted semi-private room in the middle of July, the height of tourist season. Travelers from all over the world crowded outside the gates of the hostel each evening, waiting to see if one of the dorm beds might open up. Every hostel in the city was full to capacity, and late arriving backpackers found themselves having to pay for low-end hotels, or, more bravely, sleeping in parks with new friends made on nights out. We had reserved in advance, following a travel itinerary plotted by Paul, who preferred to leave nothing to chance. It was just the two of us and one silent girl from Japan who rolled her nightshirt neatly, tucking it under her pillow in the morning. How could we give this up? Rome, of all places, city of 7 hills. We were bound together, Paul and I, by our good luck, by our reticence with others. On our first night there, while the other backpackers were still out exploring the nightlife, sharing wine at little outdoor tables in the piazzas, falling in love, Paul and I read silently in our room. Even the quiet Japanese girl did not return before curfew. I listened to Paul whispering to himself before he went to sleep, and I knew he was reciting words to stave off disaster, a godless prayer. When I first met him, I found this ritual endearing. It had given him a certain pathos. Now, of course, it was but one of the many things about him I hated, almost as much as he made me hate myself. That seems like a cheery starting point. Maybe leaving you in suspense about what will happen. Two people in Rome traveling together, sick of one another, beautiful city. That was a thing that used to happen a lot more before the pandemic, right? So yeah, I would love to talk to you guys.
As the person on the stage with the least impressive bio, I feel empowered to ask the first question. As I was reading this, I was just, when the short story form is working as well as it does in this collection, I just kind of stand in awe of it. And the thing that I kept on thinking about was that how when a short story is really working well, you seem to somehow cram a whole life into it.
Yeah.
And in Rome, there's the present story moment.
Yeah.
It's kind of what's come before, and then the distinct lives of both of the characters who are in this kind of fascinatingly loving, loveless relationship. So I'm just curious because I want to steal your brain, but I how do you like the composition process and the editing process? How do you sort of remix and layer and
yeah. Oh, it's a great question. I'm about to refer to the John Gardner book on writing fiction. I know you know that book. I don't know if other people. I'm referring to it at my peril because I probably don't actually remember it. But I think he says something where there are three ways to start a story. It's either sort of telling something that you already know, like retelling a story that's already happened, or you know a destination and you're sort of writing towards the destination, or there's a starting point and you don't know where you're going, and I think that's where you get into other people's like headlights analogy, where you're like, I know where I'm starting, but where we're going, I have no idea. I definitely, that seems to be the only way that I know how to write, is sort of the like, here's a situation, and then and I think it's a lot of like instinct and sort of feeling around, and then I hope I'm answering your question. I'm like, what was there? Then I have the benefit of having a really good reader in the form of the person who happens to be my husband, and so he tends to sort of be good at like stepping back and sort of having being able to read it and sort of analyze and sort of see and sort of help me see, okay, here these seem to be the forces at work, and so then I think it's kind of going back and tightening the motivation and the causality and the connections. Did I answer that question? I don't know. No. How do you do it, JP? Maybe that's.
Well, I don't write short stories. That's my secret.
Well, I write poems.
Yeah.
And what you said, this sounds like you talk like a poet.
Yeah.
Because I think most people who write lyric poetry, you don't know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
You have the image or the trigger for it, whatever it might be, and then you write the poem to discover where you're going.
Yeah.
So that. Is that why you start your bio, Joanna Pearson is the last poet?
I think I mainly started to acknowledge the weird Joanna of all trades, master of none sort of aspect. Like if I frame it that way, it feels somehow intentional in a way that may not be true. But no, I do think you're right. I think that the feeling of a shape in a poem to me does feel similar to the feeling of a shape in a story, and probably there is on some grander level. I'm sure that holds true to a novel, but it's like you can hold it in your hand with unless it's an epic poem, you can hold it in your hand with a poem and with a story in a way that feels really clear to me, and I think you can sort of see echoes. Like you can't have a detail in a story without it holding resonance, and I think that's also true in a poem. Like if you accidentally, I can't think of a good detail, but if the person's like specifically eating Ritz crackers, like that sort of probably has to hold some kind of meaning and do some kind of work, just given the short form. Questions, guys.
One of your stories writing made me think of a poem of yours that I really love, Minotaur. And it's interesting the way that you're engaging with these storytelling traditions and writing kind of, I don't like a cover almost. And in the same way that like the Scissor Sisters cover of Comfortably Numb is like equally awesome.
Yeah.
You know, the story really pulls off the Little Red fairy tale, but in this totally surprising way. And I guess I'm just curious, like at what point in the process of composing do you decide, okay, I'm in conversation with this other text, or is that from the outset, or do you does it slowly dawn on you that, oh, you know what, this is, you know, the wolf masks, going to visit grandmother, oh, it was all here the whole time.
If you haven't read it yet, JP's referring specifically to a story that is sort of, some people I think have not quite seen that, but you're astute, so you saw it. It is kind of a very loose retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. And in that particular story, I don't think that was the intention. And again, that may have more to do with the fact that I'm not an intentional person. I wish I were an intentional person. But very quickly, it felt to me that the mood of the story was a mood of threat, and the main character was going to see her grandmother, and it was almost like how can that not be in conversation with everybody's first story of like threat and going to grandmother. I feel like at least in the Western world, this was almost like it had to be. But yeah, I think that I did figure that out pretty early on. But yeah, and I think that's actually a very poetry thing, like the being in conversation.
Yeah. Speaking of which, do you remember the title of your senior thesis? Do you remember?
Was it the faces at other tables?
Look at that, the faces at other tables, which to me is such a fiction title, you know, because you're interested in what they're doing and what their story, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Joanna, you've always had these twin urges in you. I mean, you're an excellent poet, but you're such a wonderful story writer. Did this exist your whole life? Were you doing this when you were, you know, like Josie's age? When did you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, that's a thing. It's so fun, you know. It's like the only thing that's never really held appeal, I think, because I'm so bad at dialogue. I'm not good at dialogue. I'm not gonna say I'm bad. Just not gifted at dialogue. Plays have never stood out, but I think anything else is just like getting in the sand and playing around. And so I've always liked them both. And then, you know, to be honest, I think what sort of emerged is I do think your taste as a reader probably do start to show you your taste as a writer, and I found that like increasingly I was much more consistently interested in what people were doing in fiction, and again, poetry was very important to me. I think that's partly why the Last Poet, like that was, and I think a lot of my characters actually, I mean, one could probably surmise just based on I have these characters who have like intense relationships to poems in certain times in their life. But yeah, I think now where I want to play in that sandbox, really, it feels like it's it feels like it's fiction. You know, I love poets. I love poetry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I'm not great.
Counter session over here. Michael and I were actually talking about writing a little bit.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, you know, works of art that deal with the incredibly traumatic thing that's happening at the time. So like, you know, Donald Entry, you know, Without, or Elegy, you know, or, you know, even like the Decameron was written while the plague is going on.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm like, the conventional wisdom is that writers need some distance from the really crappy thing that's going on to write about it. But when did you write that? that story, which is felt so troublingly.
March 2020.
Mm.
I actually agree with you. I think you're right. I think there's sort of like a perfect distance when you're sort of just far away enough and not too close. And I think March 2020 was not the perfect distance, but I think every now and then you break a rule, but I actually generally agree. Someone, I don't remember where this was, but we were talking about sort of like these like national or international kind of traumas, and like remember 9/11, and it was like people were like, well, when is anybody going to be able to sort of engage with that artistically? And it was also very daunting. Like, if you come, you better come correct. Like, if you're gonna try and like address that or even really acknowledge it peripherally, you better try and do it well. I suspect that the engagement with the pandemic that is really going to happen maybe a little bit later. I don't even know if this is where you're going with that.
No, well, I'm trying to figure out how you nailed it. I just feel like it's it's such a great story.
Well, and I also think it was, the thing about it is that it's a little bit of it was early enough in this particular pandemic we're living in that it's still a bit of a fictional pandemic. I don't think it's entirely, it's a realistic story, but I don't know that it's entirely rooted in definite 2020, 2021 like COVID reality. There's a little.
I read it as our next.
Yeah. It's like a little. It's a little vague and it's.
Super happy.
It is a little.
You're such a cheerful writer.
Well, do you know what Joy Williams, the great Joy Williams, said? She said in some interview, and it's like a lot of things with Joy Williams. Like, often when I read a Joy Williams story, I'm like, yes, and then I'm like, what exactly did you mean, Joy Williams? But it's very it's powerful, and I feel it intuitively, but sometimes I don't know that I could even articulate it. She said something like, the short story is an inherently chilling form. And when she said it, I was like, yes, Joy Williams, it is. It is a chilling form. And even now, I told it to Matthew, and Matthew was like, what do you mean, Joanna? What do you mean, Joy Williams? And I was like, I don't know, but it's true, I feel.
I read another interview with her lately that ended with, the last thing she said was, of course, we all want to be poets.
You should read something. We'll read something else, then we'll talk some more. Let's hear a little more stuff.
I'll read the only thing I tend to read are beginnings, because I feel like it's weird to read middles or ends.
Okay.
Maybe I'll read. Being an uncreative person, I'm going to read the beginning of the second story.
I think we know what the third reading is.
You guys have guessed it. But I'll take requests though if anybody wants to spin the wheel. This is from Boy in the Barn. We always knew the boy was there, somewhere on the other side of the woods that lay behind the house where we spent our childhood summers. It was my grandmother's house, a low-slung red and white ranch perched way back on a slope in Burke County that felt remote, accessible only after driving a series of nauseating mountain curves, though a mere 20 minutes from town. Our grandmother presided, hands big and warm and busy, always splotched with soil or flour. She favored floral house dresses, worn soft with the years, smelling of sweat, and she was strangely beautiful for a woman so old, a woman who refused to pluck the one long whisker that corkscrewed from her chin. To keep me humble, she said to us when we dared to point it out. Now that curling whisker seems like either a lapse or an affectation, but at the time, everything about my grandmother seemed authoritative, intentional. The butter left on the windowsill, the blackened sponge she used on everything, from the dishes to the grout behind the sink, the sickly sweet-smelling syrup she poured us whenever we had a tickle in our throat. Her actions held weight, were inarguable. She and her daughter, our mother, did not speak to one another, but had reached a kind of détente when it came to us girls. Those stays with my grandmother served a purpose. Our father, remote and cerebral, could not handle my sister and me for a whole summer. He had his research to attend to and required time uninterrupted by the voices of his children. Our mother needed to travel for her teaching engagements at summer conferences, her workshops, my grandmother said with a sniff, as if the word itself were mockable. When she was not a disaster, our mother was brilliant, and she fluctuated like this between accolades and opprobrium throughout our childhood. To our grandmother, my mother's entire livelihood as a poet was silly and defensive, a hobby run amok. We learned early on the art of neutrality, poised between two such formidable powers. My sister and I slept on fold-out cots on the screened-in porch those summers at our grandmother's house. My grandmother referred to this as camping, and she had the old-fashioned habit of giving us each a hot water bottle to take to bed because it was cool at night there, even in July. We ate butter beans and cornbread and stews flavored with the fatty bits of ham. Like farmers, we rose with the sun. Our mother had told us that the man who owned the parcel of land behind my grandmother's place had a boy locked up in his barn. At night, the man let the boy out, but kept him tied to a stake. The boy ate table scraps and drank rainwater from a bucket, pacing the yard on the radius of his tether like a dog. Our mother claimed she'd seen the boy when she was a child. Maybe the boy was the old man's son or nephew. Maybe he was not even a blood relation. Whatever the case, our mother said, the boy was hardly human anymore. He'd turned wild, learning to communicate not through speech, but by a series of low growls and high-pitched yelps. Our grandmother scoffed when she heard this, then clapped her hands as if to dismiss this idea, yet another of her mother's falsehoods. Nonsense, our grandmother said, but there are chiggers and copperheads back there, and Hugh Shuffler is one mean son of us, so y'all stay off his land, here? My sister, overburdened with empathy as a child, soft as a crescent roll, started crying, convinced of the wild boy's existence. Stop your boo-hooing, my grandmother said, giving my sister a rap on the hand. Children are starving. Cry over that if you need something to cry about. My sister sniffled and quieted, but it didn't change the sounds we'd heard from my grandmother's sleeping porch at night. Whistling snorts, weird, subhuman hollering filtering through the foliage. Y'all want badness. There's plenty out there without your mother's fool stories, my grandmother said with a jerk of her chin. She crisscrossed and tied string across the door frame every night when she put us to bed, pulling it taut, then placing a series of teacups filled with water on it so that we'd have difficulty opening the screen door without upsetting her arrangement. A redneck security system, she called it, for the night she had her Bible studies. She wanted us to stay put while she was out. It was only years later, deep into our own adulthood, that we ever questioned these so-called evening Bible studies of our grandmother. She was a good time girl, my sister said. She had friends, drinking buddies. And I could see it, our grandmother coasting down the long gravel drive with her headlights off, waiting until she'd hit the main road before she'd turn them on and cruise into town, or, more likely, out to one of the bleak roadside joints miles from anything else. I could also see that wild boy in the barn, his skin raw with bites and scratches. The man in the house would finish up his supper and throw out scraps, greasy crust and chicken bones, for the boy to scrabble over, hungry, his mouth dripping like an old sore. Our mother swore up and down she'd witnessed all this. We believed her. Your mother tell you the sky's green and y'all go running out to look, my grandmother said. Doesn't make it not true, my sister whispered the moment our grandmother was out of earshot. I've seen the sky turn green sometimes. I'll stop there.
That's good. Thanks for reading such a long excerpt.
I know. I really got warmed up with the conversation.
Your characterizations are so good in this book. I know I'm not the fiction expert here, but I just think you picked such nice detail. Even something like your sister, soft as a crescent roll. Those poetic touches, not gratuitously poetic. They're really good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of writers, when fiction writers especially, but the idea is, you got to give your reader setting, and it feels like some writers are just checking out, I have one quirky detail, I have one kind of, here's how it smelled, but the way detail characterizes these folks. I'm thinking of Colin in Dear Shadows, where he's got she meets an old crush. I'm not giving away the ending, but she meets an old crush, and he's in a van, and he's got a stained hoodie, and an empty Dr. Pepper, and it's like, there goes the crush. I mean, it's such a great, it's such a great detail.
I love. I mean, that's the sort of, me loving all the other parts of the reading that are the reading. I think it's so interesting. And I think, JP, to flip it back around, and JP is a wonderful debut novel that you all should read, but it's just so, the voice is so compelling, and it feels so authentic, and I think part of that is a similar touch with, it's not an excess of detail. There's a term for that if you're just reading sort of whatever, I can't remember it. It's not that, but it's the right. It's like you're still moving, you're still in motion, there's still sort of a forward momentum, but there's a feeling of authenticity. I love that when I read. So right back at you.
Well, I feel like I'm.
Should we?
If folks have questions, just don't be shy.
Join the conversation.
Enjoy this conversation. Because I'm sure many of you might have something to ask. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. So, how many of these stories were you in the collection, and how many were from other? You said the first one had appeared before.
Yeah, good question. I can tell you exactly 3 were not previously published. And not because I was being so precious with it. Like, I totally would have, if someone would have taken them before the book came out, I would have been like, here, have them. But as it happens with the timing, yes, the three newer ones, which I think are the writing story, the story that I just read from The Boy in the Barn, and then Darling. I think those were kind of the 3 most recently composed or most recently finished. Yeah, Laura.
I wonder if you could talk about short story collections. Obviously, with a novel, you kind of have a sense of where it's going, how it falls together in the end. But with a short story collection, how do you know that you're ready for it to stand on its own? And did you feel when you were putting it together and putting together those last stories that it was speaking to a common theme, or how did that work for you?
That's a great
and what
question.
did you want to achieve?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it actually reminds me a lot of what people talk about with poetry collections. I think that process of assemblage, there's like my what really happened answer, and then like my wiser answer. So my wiser answer is that yes, I feel like there is a sort of instinctive feling of like, okay, these stories, like the concerns are kind of echoing against one another, and you can sort of feel that, and you put them, and then I guess there are certainly stories that I think there are a couple stories I've published somewhere, and I was like, I'm never going to include that in a collection, sayonara. So it's I think it's partly them resonating, then partly me still liking them. With this though, I will also just admit that this really amazing book prize, which if any of you ever write stories, you should totally enter, because it is free to enter. It's completely free to enter. And if you have, there's a requisite number of stories you have to have published in little magazines. It's free to enter, and it just seems like a free lottery ticket. And so the truth of the matter is that I saw the deadline was coming, and I was like, oh, well, that contest, why would I not cram together some stories and send it off? And truly, that was the only place I sent this bundle of stories. So it felt very like, it's like the only time in my life where something felt like it like it was meant to be. So yeah, I think they should really chime, and hopefully these do by the chance of my cramming them together. But I really did kind of like throw it into the wind, and then I had some good luck.
It's awesome because they all seem of a piece, they seem like they belong together.
I mean, I think it's because they're from the same weird, creepy Gritton. that also.
At the same weird, creepy time.
Yes.
Well, that was really my follow-up question. Is like, do you feel like it speaks to a certain point in your life, and do you feel like that's ended, or are you still working through it, and you feel like you're going to still write along that vein with those kind of characters who are at crossroads?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes and no. I mean, the funny thing is when I look back to the one other collection of short stories I have, I feel like I can very much tell where I was like in relationship to having finished residency and sort of what my concerns were. I would say they were still sort of a little creepy crossroads. I think like there are still similarities with this, so I think there probably is a vein that I'm really attracted to as a reader and a writer, and so that will probably continue. But absolutely, I think probably once I'm a bit away and look back, I'll think like, oh, Red Riding Hood. I don't know what it will be, but I'm sure. Other.
You look back and say, "Oh, that was good. I did a good job." Because that's how you do it, right?
Well,
yeah, right.
That's a nice way to feel, because sometimes you write things and you don't always feel that way years after the fact. But yes.
Another question. So, what are you working on next? Because I love this so much. I want to know that there's more.
Thank you.
From
Thank
your
you.
weird brain.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's a great question. So, I'm doing we're going to have to talk about just the frustrating world of writing things. I started working on some stories, and then my crafty self, I was like, short story collections, I love them, I buy them, but the conventional publishing wisdom is like, we don't want them. We don't want them. They don't come to us with your
novels.
Yes, come to us. So, and then there have been so many wonderful novels that I've read where I'm like, you're secretly a short story collection, you're secretly a like you're a story. I mean, I can just see it and I love it, I don't mind it. But I was like, oh, I'm gonna say this is a novel. I'm gonna make it into a novel. And so I've done that. The question is, so what degree of success? And I think there are some good, I'm not going to call them stories, chunks. There are some good chunks in there, but I may need some help massaging some of the other chunks into place. But my sister is here. My sister knows, because every now and then, just to like ramp myself up, I don't know, I'll send out to my family group text, I'll send a picture and I'll be like, 80 whatever thousand words, they may be bad, but they're there. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to work on.
when do you have time to do all this work? You're a doctor, you're a mother, you're a spouse, and yet you're producing these books. It's astonishing.
I don't know. I mean, that's why like
Great.
Well, you guys probably. I mean, I would be curious to ask you. I'm really sort of like aspirationally obsessed with when writers document their habits, and they're like, well, I get up every day at 4:30 a.m. and then I like complete. It's like a minimum of X many word. Like who was it who always he like wrote like 1,000 words every day, and then like literally at World One, even if he was mid-sentence, he would stop like at 1,000. I think it was Graham Greene actually, but was it Matthew? Was it Graham Greene who stopped every? Yeah, he would just like do his 1,000 and stop. I really, really envy that and aspire to that, and I don't do it. So I couldn't tell you when, but sometimes it happens.
I think you had a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to me that you're a psychiatrist, and there's certain things in the stories that there's like postpartum issues.
You could guess that I made a psychiatrist.
And the repressed trauma.
Yeah.
And it makes perfect sense to me. I think every that should be go hand in hand. I think Amy Bloom is also.
She is.
Interesting.
But it also, and this might be a really stupid question, but how, like, do the boundaries with your patients, like, how does that work?
Yeah.
I would be like, oh, I would be gunning to get into your next collection.
I think it turns out they're not gunning. I don't think. It's funny. I think it's a great question, and I think it's a particularly relevant question for people who may have recently been reading. I don't know if you haven't read this, you should, because it's just like a gossipy sensation. It's just like a sensational read. First, there was the cat person story that really went viral, and then there was the person who wrote, and she was like, I guess she wasn't the cat person, but I was the woman from Cat Person, and she used all my details. And then more recently, there was this just like scrumptious train wreck of an article called Bad Art Friend. Has anybody read it already?
I became instantly obsessed with it.
It's just, you're just like, the funny thing is, I will say so, and so I think a lot of people are reckoning. I actually volunteer with a little tiny literary magazine, and someone just wrote to me and said, I've read Bad Art Friend, and I know you accepted this story, which to me the story was like perfectly good and reasonable. And he was like, but there's one character in it who's based on somebody in real life, and I just read Bad Art Friend, and like I just have to pull this story back and like either revise it or send something else. And I guess what I'll say is that I have been so overly paranoid almost about ever being perceived I mean, every writer draws from kernels of real life, obviously, but I've been so paranoid of like, even if it weren't intentional, like I'm writing a story about a florist, and then like I happen to in my day job be working with like that's like my nightmare. I never want someone to be like, oh, I'm a florist. Was she still like, was she just like, she made my hair blonde instead of I'm so fearful of that I think I have kind of like tried to sort of overcorrect against that from the go, but I think that's the nature of like my professional terror of stepping over that line. So I'm kind of loving this hubbub. I mean, it sounds miserable for the people involved, but I mean, this is like the faces of other tables. I'm like,
Go on Twitter.
Yes. I'm not even on Twitter. But I literally, after I read it, I was like, I have to because you can like search on Twitter if you're not on Twitter. I was like, I have to like see what people are saying because I have to know. Yeah, that's a tangent, but that's a great question. How are we on time?
Where's our host? How are we doing on time? 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was quite specific.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions. Please read this Bad Art Friend if you haven't read it, and then talk to me about it.
You have the question. I have a question.
Yeah.
Revising fiction.
Yeah.
Revising prose. It seems to be harder than revising a poem. Do you think that's true? When do you stop? Can't you just always keep polishing that sentence? Make it a little better, a little sharper?
No, not if you're me, because I have the gift of impatience. Wow.
Gift of impatience.
Yes, it's called. Yeah, that's going to be my next self-help book called The Gift of Impatience. No, I don't tend to do that, and in fact, one trouble that I have is that, and I know there are other writers in the room and writers on the stage, so I'm curious if anybody wants to disclose. I am very guilty of I have what I call the intoxication phase, which is really good. I think it's actually helpful to me. I truly need it. I think I couldn't write if I didn't have a phase where there's also a self-hating phase that comes later. But I need the intoxication phases because I have to be so enthralled with myself, and I have to have this phase where I'm like, well, I've slopped over it a couple times. It's ready for the New Yorker, and I really have it's probably really embarrassing. Someday I'm going to meet these people I don't know at literary magazines to whom, and Matthew will actually be like, Joanna, it's a good draft, but sit on it. Sit on it, read it again.
Sober up.
Yes, sober up. Check for typos, because there will be a million typos. And meanwhile, he's saying that, and I've literally just been send, submit, and I just nod, and then truly, the next day or the day later, I pull it up and I look at it, and sure enough, it's rife with typos. It's but that's fine. That's just my rejection round. That's just the. But yeah, I go through the intoxication phase, and then I sort of have to make myself revise. But then I don't over.
Intoxication, self-hate. Are there other phases, or are those the two basic phases?
Those are the two basic phases. Those are the. Well, I mean, before the intoxication, there's also the
Ed labor phase.
Yeah, yes. There's the kind of but I mean, do you guys get the intoxication phase? It's a good thing.
You know.
Yeah, you know if you get it.
I know the feeling of this has gotta go out now.
Yes.
And then it's never realer than when you open the PDF of the thing you just sent, and
you
then you hate the title, and then
I've done it so much. I mean, thankfully none of these people care about me, so it's I'm Deborah Treisman, you're gonna love this. Please read it now. To the slush pile. I'm sending it to the. It feels great. It feels great until,
Fantastic.
Yeah, until you sober up. Yeah.
Other questions? We don't need to dominate here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Since you're working on a novel, some of these characters, they feel, the protagonist of Rome kind of feels Whaler's wife, right? There's a certain kinship there. And how do you decide it's a novel and not a story that's just gotten a little too big for its own good or something?
I mean,
it's a big question. But.
Very well, maybe a story that's gotten too big.
Maybe it should have been a poem.
Yeah. It's all would have been avoided if it had just been a sonnet. It's just done. GP, I should ask you that because I think you have written a very beautiful novel. I could ask Adam without Price in the crowd. I could ask him that. I mean, I could ask. I think it's fair to say that I don't know what I'm doing. My poetry MFA did not equip me with. I would say structure in general is probably not my forte. And so I once heard recommended this book. It's like a book for screenwriters. It wasn't Save the Cat, which I think is really famous, but it was another book that was like write a novel in 30 days. It was like that type of thing. And I was like, well, this will be really good for me because I'm all like intoxication and impulse and I'm flying until I fall. And this will sort of like make me sit down and like maybe I'll make a chart. Like I feel like there are things that they're like magical secrets that novelists probably do, and they probably have like note cards and lists and outlines and just like these like smart organized things. But I actually haven't done them yet, so I don't know. Did you do a lot of organizational?
No, and if you figure out the way to do it, like I need to talk to a tenure committee pretty soon. So if you please let me know, 'cause I'm in trouble right now.
We're gonna figure it out. We're gonna figure it out after tonight.
But the title of your book is Now You Know It All, right?
Yes.
So now we know it all.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
No irony to that title, right?
No.
So, how did you land on that title?
Great question. So partly, I was very pleased with myself over the title falling into place. So partly, it alludes to a poem that gets referred to in one of the stories towards the end. So there's a story called Dear Shadows where the main character is really, there's a poem that she finds very beautiful. It's a poem that I find very beautiful. It's a poem that's really stuck with me. And there's a little epigraph from that poem in the very beginning. Dear shadows, now you know it all the folly of a fight with the common wrong or right. The innocent and the beautiful have no enemy but time. Arise and bid me strike a match and strike another till time catch. That's just a small chunk of the poem, but I liked the title in that it was sort of speaking to that particular story a little bit, but I also like in the sense that I think a good short story always is sort of the tip of the iceberg and sort of leaving things out, and there's a lot that's unsaid, and it is sort of an obviously ironic title, so I kind of loved it for that way that it played too.
Also Yeats.
Yeah, Yeats. I all my titles are stolen from poets, and they have a sort of metrical every human love. Now you know it all. It just rings in the ears.
It's Mortal Myth.
Yeah. Well, it's Mortal Myth. Exactly.
Did we nail it? You helped us nail it, audience. Thank you, and thank you, Joanna.
So thank you so much for coming and for your constant support of Flyleaf Books. Please keep an eye out on our website and on our weekly newsletter for upcoming events. Fun fact, we're starting to do more kids events. This fall, we actually have Kwame Mavaliak, author of Tristan Strong, coming on October 13th. We have Donna Washington reading Boost 2 on October 22nd, and on October 28th, we have Jeff Keeney coming here, the author of Diary of a Wimpy Kid, for an interactive drive-through. So please go on our website for more info. Thank you.
Yeah.